Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Best of Pedalshift. On this edition, we're going to go all the way back to January 2019 and Pedalshift project number 148, Riding Your Bike to the Airport. This was a fun episode, and it's relevant to the now times as this edition drops. I'm going to be riding my bicycle literally all the way up to Medford Airport as part of the tour that you're going to be hearing about in the next couple of weeks here on the show. This was an episode where I was experimenting about riding my Brompton to National Airport here in Washington, D.C., and came up with a few tips about how to accomplish that in a bike touring context. So, relevant, interesting, and hopefully something that you'll enjoy right now. Next up on this very jam-packed show is The Lab, and The Lab is where we talk about experiments and things that are helpful for bike touring. And I don't know if this fits in The Lab so much. I think it does because to me, it was an experiment. And I know a lot of folks ride to train stations and to other places of transit, but I've never myself ridden a bike to the airport with the intent of starting a bike tour. So I decided to do a little bit of a test going to the airport because I've got this February tour coming up and I'm flying out of National Airport, DCA, which is, as the crow flies, it's about an hour ride. I can actually do it in a little bit less, but it just sort of depends on the nature of kind of hitting lights and how fast I'm going, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because it's on a lot of trails once you get on the bridge over the Potomac River. So I thought I would test it out. And I was really surprised at the results of that test ride. I kind of came in with a bunch of assumptions. My first assumption is, hey, bicycling is always the most efficient way to get to a place. And that's largely true, especially in a city. And then also that it was going to be easy and that the timing would work out really well and that it would be something that I would consider for all sorts of different flights that I would have coming up. Well, I think that the answer to many of these things is that it's more shades of gray than black and white. And well, as so many things in life, right? So here are kind of some tips based on my experience from doing the dry run and other elements of having traveled with a bike a lot, about how to bike to an airport. First thing I would recommend is do what I did, and that is do a dry run. Because what I found was that things were a lot slower and harder than I anticipated. The things, and this may be peculiar about this airport, but I think that it may be true of others as well. Cars are sort of the grand beasties of airports. Airports are designed for people to get cars as close as possible and then to get people off and into the airport and going. It's less so for bicycles in many, many, many circumstances. Even a really great bicycling city like DC or Portland, the bicycle infrastructure is much, much less the closer that you get to the airport. And sometimes what that means is that you may think that you're getting up to the airport, bicycling right up to the airport, and you're not really quite doing that. That was my experience with DCA. There is a great trail, the Mount Vernon Trail, that goes right by the airport. You can see it. You actually go by this area called Gravelly Point, and you see the planes lifting off, taking off, landing, etc. It's actually kind of cool if you're into that. You go just a little bit further, and there's an access point trail that takes you right into the airport. And I thought, oh wow, that's really cool. It must take you very, very, very close to the terminals. That's not really the case. It sort of spits you off at the far corner of one of the parking garages. And while that may seem like you're there, the reality is that technically speaking, you're not allowed to ride your bike anymore from that point. Some people might have done that who are behind a microphone right now. Although, as our friend Brock from Sprocket would say, that would be wrong. The thing is that I was quite far away, further away than even the metro drops you off, the metro rail line. Our subway line in DC actually gets you a lot closer. So what I found was that if you were to be a rule follower and you weren't going to ride your bike anymore from there, you weren't going to ride through the garage area, you have to walk your bike, or in my case with the Brompton, fold it up and kind of roll it. And you're a very long walk away from things. Now, if I was dropped off with a car, I'm often dropped off within a couple hundred feet of even the check-in desk that I'm going to. So add that time to everything. And also, I got really freaking lost because the signage is just not there once you're inside that area. Worse, when I was trying to get out of the airport area, I couldn't find that spot again through the parking garage if my life depended on it. That's why I was riding my bike at that point, because I was like, I'm not just going to keep hauling my bike around trying in vain to find this spot, this one little subterranean corner where there's this one little teeny tiny access point to the trail, because otherwise it's all like highway style roads and things like that. So that was the kind of thing that got me thinking, you know what, doing a dry run is a really important kind of thing. Now, if you're flying to another city's airport, you may not have that be a possibility. Lots of people have done YouTube videos for a variety of different airports on how to get in and get out of airports. So you may want to check YouTube for that kind of stuff. Turns out DC does not have that. And so I may do that for National Airport for DCA at some point in the future, because it is kind of tucked away. Another point here, and this kind of gets to what I was talking about, is biking versus cars and the reverse efficiency at the end. So the efficiency of these places is built around vehicles dropping you off, not necessarily bicycles dropping you off or taking you there. In this instance, at this airport, you are so much further away compared to where you are if you're dropped off with a car. So you have to factor that time in. It's a weird conundrum, because for so many of us who are used to bicycling in cities, when we compare our arrivals to any of a variety of places versus our friends who are driving cars and circling around looking for parking that is often blocks away, and then they have to hoof it for the last, few blocks because they found an empty spot for their car. If I'm bicycling to a coffee shop, a cafe, a bar, or whatever, usually I'm parking right outside. If there's a bike rack or a street sign or something like that, I'm locking right up to it and I'm good and I'm right there. It's the reverse at airports often, and it certainly is true here. So be mindful of the fact that it's a reverse efficiency situation for you. And if you're used to bicycling being the most efficient way when you're at the end, it's sometimes the opposite. So keep that in mind. Locks. This was a really interesting thing. I did not take a picture of the lock setup there, just because I wanted to respect the privacy of the folks who had their bikes at the airport. But, you definitely want to be mindful if you're going to be bicycling to the airport, but not taking your bike with you, which for a lot of folks is a thing. It may not be kind of relevant in the bike touring concept, but it might be relevant to you in some other trip that you want to do. You want to be really careful about how you lock your bike, and even more so depending on where the bike parking is. At National Airport, this spot is great. It's covered. It's away from stuff. You kind of would have to know that it's there to even get to it. But the one thing I'd say is, man, there's nobody that's going to see. Like, if somebody wanted to come there with an angle grinder, they could really easily do it. Now, I'm saying bike thieves who listen to the show, first of all, you're evil and I don't like you. Stop listening to my show. But, that's a spot that would be it's counterintuitive. It feels like it's got high protectability, but at the same time, because it's so quiet and because it's so easy to get at, I think it'd be pretty easy for bike thieves to get at. So you don't want to be the lowest hanging fruit whenever you're locking your bike up any place. But at an airport, I would definitely recommend you have at least a couple of locks, or at least do the U-lock and the cable, and practice good locking technique. I've talked about this on past episodes of the show, and I'll probably do it again at some point, but be mindful of all of that when you lock your bike up if you're going to be leaving it and flying off for a few days. I've done some research for National Airport and on message boards and whatnot. For the most part, everybody's had a pretty good time with it. Nobody's ever had any issues at any of the various spots where you can lock up your bike. But, your mileage may vary. It just depends on the city that you're at and the exposure that your bike has. Next note. Bike to carry transition. This goes back to the original point, because in many places you're not allowed to ride your bike. But what you've got is a scenario. Let's say you're considering a bike tour and you're going to be boxing up your bike, or maybe you've got a folding bike like a Brompton or a Tern or something like that. The transition when you've got stuff on your bike, suitcase, panniers, whatever, that takes a few minutes to transition from a scenario where you've got stuff hanging on your bike to getting it off of your bike and then getting into a bag so that you can push your bike or carry your bike and carry your other gear, maybe in a duffel bag or something like that. That takes time, and it always takes me more time than I ever think. So be mindful that some of the things that you don't have to think about when you're dropped off at a curb by a vehicle, bus, car, whatever, it's going to be a little bit harder when you're coming off of your bike because you don't just instantly go around to the trunk, pull out a bag and go. You've got to get off. You've got to take things off the bike. You've got to do a variety of different things. So in addition to maybe being further away than you're used to, you've got stuff you've got to pull together. So add that to your prep time as well. One thing that came up, and I never really even thought about this, but as I was reading some accounts of folks who ride their bikes to the airport, they got extra scrutiny at TSA here in the States. Now, internationally, you may be finding this as well. I do know that this is relatively new kind of in a post 9/11 world for those of us. But one of the things that are looked at is, are you sweating when you go through? Because apparently people who have bad ideas or want to do bad things are often sweating when they go through security because I guess they're nervous and stuff. So that gets you more scrutiny. So a lot of folks, when they're checking in and going through security lines and they're sweating because they came through on their bike, they get that extra scrutiny, maybe extra pat downs, things like that. So may want to focus on giving yourself even more time than normal getting through security. As we add up all these things, it's starting to get to the point where, if you are used to it getting there an hour ahead, well, now maybe you need to be an hour and a half or maybe even a little bit more depending on what your situation is because of all of these various different factors. It's very interesting. The buffer time that I recommend, well, I should back off. I'm one of those types. I used to travel a lot for a previous line of work, and I got very used to being very regimented about how I travel when I fly. I always want to be at the airport at least 1 hour ahead, especially if I'm checking bags. But that buffer time, when it starts getting eaten into at all because of all of the various things in life that can kind of delay you, whether it's traffic or whether it's delays in lines and things along those lines, that always gets me extra nervous. So when I did this dry run, I was realizing, man, I need more buffer time because of all of these various things that came up. So I would encourage you as well, unless you're one of those kind of fly by the seat of the pants type of person who's just like, I show up at the airport 40 minutes before boarding and just see how it goes. That would drive me crazy. My poor girlfriend, who is much more like that than I am, sees me go into the third, fourth, and fifth circles of hell mentally whenever we are eating into that buffer time. So that's just how I roll. Your mileage may vary, but buffer time, make sure you've got enough of it. And I think the last piece here is that some airports are best unbiked. And when I say that reluctantly, because I feel like that a bicycle should be able to get you anywhere and from anywhere. But some airports, frankly, are just built on highways, and there's really no realistic way to get out of there. I'm not 100% sure about this, but one that's coming to mind is Denver's airport. It's quite literally in the middle of nowhere, and I don't know if they've added bicycle infrastructure, but my recollection of it is that you're on basically a highway that connects you to another highway, and there's not much else out there. Now, that may have changed, but that's an example of the type of an airport where I just don't think it would be a really good idea to be on a bicycle. So do your research, look ahead. Sometimes you're better off doing what I'm going to be doing for my next bike tour, and that is, I'm not going to bike to either airport in any of the situations. And it's not because I can't. It's just that it doesn't fit what I need to do. So for my outbound flight leaves at 7 a.m. The sun doesn't even come up until about then this time of year. So not only would I be bicycling in the dark, but all of these other various things that I discovered about bicycling to National Airport is that, well, frankly, I'd have to go super, super, super extra earlier. And I'm not a morning person. And frankly, you know what? I think I'm just going to do what I usually do, which is to get a Lyft or an Uber, probably a Lyft. I don't know why. I like Lyft better these days. And, my bike goes in the trunk, my bag goes in the trunk, and then I'm there within about 15 minutes and I'm right out front. And then I don't have to wake up as early. And also, it might be 10 degrees. So who knows? But on the Tampa side, as I looked at it, doesn't look like it's a very good airport to bicycle out of. It looks like it's possible, but it also looks like it's a little bit dicey. So I'm going to start the tour by getting a lift to Cypress Point Park, which is a state or a city park that's right on the water. It's a perfect spot to start a bike tour. So that's where I'm going to get dropped off, and that's where I'm going to start bicycling. So I'll literally be biking from water to water.
And there's all sorts of other places where bicycling from an airport totally makes sense. I've done it from Portland before to my brother's place. It's completely fine. There's good infrastructure. You can do it. It's built for it. They thought about it. Some places it's just not like that. So do your research. Get on it ahead of time. Make sure that you've got buffer time. And if you've got an opportunity to do a dry run, make sure you do that. If you're going to lock your bike, if you're not bringing your bike with you, make sure you're practicing really, really smart locking etiquette because it's a good spot for thieves to get at in a lot of different places. But don't let this be a deterrent to biking to or from an airport. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedalshift project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.